Section 36 of Gray's Anatomy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4, by Henry Gray. Anterior Divisions, Part 1. 6b. The Anterior Divisions. Rami anteriores. The anterior divisions of the spinal nerves supply the anterolateral parts of the trunk and the limbs. They are for the most part larger than the posterior divisions. In the thoracic region they run independently of one another, but in the cervical, lumbar, and sacral regions they unite near their origins to form plexuses. The cervical nerves, nervus cervicalis. The anterior divisions of the cervical nerves, rami anteriores, with the exception of the first, pass outward between the intertransversarii anterior and posterior, lying on the grooved upper surfaces of the transverse processes of the vertebrae. The anterior division of the first or suboccipital nerve issues from the vertebral canal above the posterior arch of the atlas, and runs forward round the lateral aspect of its superior articular process, medial to the vertebral artery. In most cases it descends medial to and in front of the rectus capitis lateralis, but occasionally it pierces the muscle. The anterior divisions of the upper four cervical nerves unite to form the cervical plexus, and each receives a grey ramus communicans from the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. Those of the lower four cervical, together with the greater part of the first thoracic, form the brachial plexus. They each receive a grey ramus communicans, those for the fifth and sixth being derived from the middle, and those for the seventh and eighth from the lowest cervical ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. The cervical plexus, plexus cervicalis. The cervical plexus is formed by the anterior divisions of the upper four cervical nerves. Each nerve, except the first, divides into an upper and a lower branch, and the branches unite to form three loops. The plexus is situated opposite the upper four cervical vertebrae, in front of the levator scapulae and scalenus medius, and covered by the sternocleidomastoideus. Its branches are divided into two groups, superficial and deep, and are here given in tabular form. The figures following the names indicate the nerves from which the different branches take origin. Superficial. Smaller occipital, 2c. Greater auricular, 2-3c. Cutaneous cervical, 2-3c. Supraclavicular, 3-4c. Deep. Internal, communicating, with hypoglossal, 1-2c, with vagus, 1-2c, with sympathetic, 1-2-3-4c. Muscular. Rectus capitis lateralis, 1c. Rectus capitis anterior, 1-2c. Longus capitis, 1-2-3c. Communicantes cervicalis, 2-3c. Phrenic, 3-4-5c. Communicating with accessory, 2-3-4c. External, muscular. Sternocleidomastoideus, 2c. Trapezius, 3-4c. Levator scapulae, 3-4c. Scalenus medius, 3-4c. Superficial branches of the cervical plexus. The smaller occipital nerve, nervus occipitalis minor, small occipital nerve, arises from the second cervical nerve, sometimes also from the third. It curves around and ascends along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus. Near the cranium it perforates the deep fascia, and is continued upward along the side of the head behind the auricular, supplying the skin and communicating with the greater occipital, the greater auricular, and posterior auricular branch of the facial. The smaller occipital varies in size and is sometimes duplicated. It gives off an auricular branch, which supplies the skin of the upper and back part of the auricular, communicating with the mastoid branch of the great auricular. This branch is occasionally derived from the greater occipital nerve. The great auricular nerve, nervus auricularis magnus, is the largest of the ascending branches. It arises from the second and third cervical nerves, winds around the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus, and, after perforating the deep fascia, ascends upon that muscle beneath the platysma to the parotid gland, where it divides into an anterior and a posterior branch. The anterior branch, ramus anterior, facial branch, is distributed to the skin of the face over the parotid gland, and communicates in the substance of the gland with the facial nerve. The posterior branch, ramus posterior, mastoid branch, supplies the skin over the mastoid process and on the back of the auricula, except at its upper part. A filament pierces the auricula to reach its lateral surface, where it is distributed to the lobule and lower part of the concha. The posterior branch communicates with the smaller occipital, the auricular branch of the vagus, and the posterior auricular branch of the facial. The cutaneous cervical, nervus cutaneus colli, superficial or transverse cervical nerve, arises from the second and third cervical nerves, turns around the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus about its middle, and, passing obliquely forward beneath the external jugular vein to the anterior border of the muscle, it perforates the deep cervical fascia, and divides beneath the platysma into ascending and descending branches, which are distributed to the anterolateral parts of the neck. The ascending branches, rami superiores, pass upward to the submaxillary region, and form a plexus with the cervical branch of the facial nerve beneath the platysma. Others pierce that muscle, and are distributed to the skin of the upper and front part of the neck. The descending branches, rami inferiores, pierce the platysma, and are distributed to the skin of the side and front of the neck, as low as the sternum. The supraclavicular nerves, nervus supraclaviculares, descending branches, arise from the third and fourth cervical nerves. They emerge beneath the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus, and descend in the posterior triangle of the neck beneath the platysma and deep cervical fascia. Near the clavicle they perforate the fascia and platysma to become cutaneous, and are arranged, according to their position, into three groups: anterior, middle, and posterior. The anterior supraclavicular nerves, nervus supraclaviculares anteriores, suprasternal nerves, cross obliquely over the external jugular vein and the clavicular and sternal heads of the sternocleidomastoideus, and supply the skin as far as the middle line. They furnish one or two filaments to the sternoclavicular joint. The middle supraclavicular nerves, nervus supraclaviculares medii, supraclavicular nerves, cross the clavicle and supply the skin over the pectoralis major and deltoideus, communicating with the cutaneous branches of the upper intercostal nerves. The posterior supraclavicular nerves, nervus supraclaviculares posteriores, supraacromial nerves, pass obliquely across the outer surface of the trapezius and the acromion, and supply the skin of the upper and posterior parts of the shoulder. Deep branches of the cervical plexus, internal series. The communicating branches consist of several filaments, which pass from the loop between the first and second cervical nerves to the vagus, hypoglossal, and sympathetic. The branch to the hypoglossal ultimately leaves that nerve as a series of branches, viz., the descending ramus, the nerve to the thyreohyoideus, and the nerve to the geniohyoideus. A communicating branch also passes from the fourth to fifth cervical, while each of the first four cervical nerves receives a grey ramus communicans from the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic. Muscular branches supply the longus capitis, rectus capitis anterior, and rectus capitis lateralis. The communicantes cervicalis, communicantes hypoglossae, consist usually of two filaments, one derived from the second and the other from the third cervical. These filaments join to form the descendens cervicalis, which passes downward on the lateral side of the internal jugular vein, crosses in front of the vein a little below the middle of the neck, and forms a loop, ansa hypoglossae, with the descending ramus of the hypoglossal in front of the sheath of the carotid vessels. Occasionally the loop is formed within the sheath. The phrenic nerve, nervus phrenicus, internal respiratory nerve of Bell, contains motor and sensory fibres in the proportion of about 2 to 1. It arises chiefly from the fourth cervical nerve, but receives a branch from the third and another from the fifth. The fibres from the fifth occasionally come through the nerve to the subclavius. It descends to the root of the neck, running obliquely across